Good afternoon, and today we're here to talk about a book that's written by my guest on the right, Dr. Matt Treacy. On my left is the Malachy Steenson. So, Matt, first of all, welcome to the show, and yourself, Malachy, welcome as well. Matt, I'm going to ask you. The book is called A Tunnel to the Moon: The End of the Irish Republican Army. I'm going to ask you because I've seen some of the criticism and some of the invective that you've got on social media. Why did you write this book? Was it a cathartic book? Because it's quite different from the previous book that we spoke about, which was very much an academic book.
Yeah, I suppose it was... Actually, when I started writing it, I hadn't even envisaged it being published. They've been at me for years about money and just... The thing that I joined no longer existed. So.
The book very much it's saying that it's an honest book in the sense that you said you were a member of the IRA. So can I go back to the very beginning, and I'll put the same question to you that I put to Christy Burke. Why did you join the IRA?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, it was... My family, though, has been involved, going back to the Fenians, Invincibles, actually. Sure. And it's just kind of a family tradition, but also the fact that what was going on in the north, that actually Malachy would be more closer to my uncles in terms of the officials than I would have been, but yeah, it's a combination of historical reasons, family heritage, and tradition, what was going on in the north, socialist, and seemed to be the right thing to do.
Yeah, no, because the reason why I asked this is when I said to Christy, why did you join the IRA? Because he said he joined it at 15 and his mother brought him up to the people. And I said, why did you join? He said, to get the Brits out. And I said, but Christy, the Brits haven't been in the North Inner City for 50 years. So it struck me as just that there seem to be family connections were as important as anything else. Is that fair to say in your case?
Yeah, well, my grandmother was inner city dope, and her family had been involved in the Invincibles and the Tam War and later than that. And yeah, it's partly tradition. That's what Conor Cruz O'Brien said, wasn't it? The Republicans was inherited through the females. But,
Malachy, are you going to be as candid as Matt? Did you join the IRA?
Well,
you're very long associated with the Republican movement.
Matt has been convicted of membership of the army. I joined the Republican movement, and again, it came from a long line of my mother, my father, my grandparents, my uncles were all members of the Republican movement. Many of them spent time in jail. My grandfather and my grandmother were in jail. My uncles were in jail. My father was in jail. My brother was convicted of offences related to the Provisionals. I think Matt's book, the title of it particularly, A Tunnel to the Moon, I think most of us now feel, and that's a quote from Anthony McIntyre, feel that we may as well have been digging a tunnel to the moon as to have been involved in a conflict which has led us to where we are. And it's not, I would predict, the end of the Irish Republican Army. It's certainly the end of the Provisional Army. And Matt goes through in great detail, and it's set out very well the decline and the removal, in fact, of any shred of republicanism from the Provisional movement. And it's been taken over by liberals and careerists and opportunists who could be in any political party, and their pure objective is power and money.
Can I put it to you that I remember when the split happened in 1969. I think I was 19 years of age, and at the time you would have been associated with what is now known as the official IRA, the official
the official Republican movement.
Yeah. And
Well, I would have been a young child, man.
exactly. Yeah, and I suspect you possibly weren't even born at that stage, or if you were rattling in a pram.
It's 4.
Yeah. But so if I put it to you then, Matt, to me the split was much along ideological lines. There may have been logistic issues as well, but my clear memory of that, because I was in second year in UCD, was that it divided along nationalist versus socialist lines. You joined what we would have said was the nationalist, in fact, derogatorily. People that I was associated with at the time said the Provisional movement was a bunch of small Catholic shopkeepers. You don't strike me as being a Catholic shopkeeper, Matt. So why did you join the Provisionals then?
Well, I don't know what I would have done in 1969 or 1970. I met Sean Garland a few times, and great admiration for Sean Garland. My uncles would have been involved in the IRA at the same time he was. But like when I joined in the early mid-80s, the Provisional movement would have been quite left-wing,
Or quasi anyway. Yeah.
ostensibly.
Yeah.
So, and they were also involved in fighting the Brits. So,
but so was Malachy's guys. They were in fact in the early days. People would have said the initiative, particularly outside of Belfast, was with the what derogatorily became known as the Stickies. Was ideology any part of yours, Malachy, or was the tradition, family tradition, stronger?
As a 7-year-old at that time, and in the early 70s, clearly my family was with the ORM at the time, so that's where we were naturally aligned at that age anyway. We subsequently fell out and left them and returned somewhat later. But you know, you have to remember the IRA in 1972 went on ceasefire on a defence and retaliation. They never stood down, they never surrendered, despite the political pronouncements from the political leaders that the official IRA didn't exist. I think it's still accepted that the official IRA exists. It's still an armed army. And it went on a defence and retaliation ceasefire, and subsequently was involved in defending itself from attacks from both the Provisionals and the IRA at different stages, and from Crown forces. I mean, I was just thinking the other day, I was reading Matt's book, one of my first recollections of political activity was selling a montage picture of Coleman Rowntree and Martin McAlinden, who were shot dead by British troops in South Down. And that was in around 73 or 74, and selling that for on Common which was the prisoners' dependence fund. All of the different organisations have different groups, but the officials one was on Common And like, we were very clear that we were involved in a war to unite Ireland and to get the Brits out. And the officials were losing bigger numbers than the Provisionals at the time, and were involved in more battles and more serious battles. If you look at the Battle of the Falls, which the Provisionals have now rewritten when they weren't even involved in it at all, you know. But where we are now, I mean, the Provisionals have surrendered weapons that other people risked their lives and their liberty to acquire. They've surrendered those. Sharon Hock, I mean, if you look at our own constituency, last time around, they ran a candidate who's now in jail for torture, nothing to do with republicanism, is alleged to have been involved in the Hutch-Kinnan feud. And that's the type of political representatives that they're bringing forward, people with no politics other than the pursuit of power, and it's greed.
But there was a similar thing happened to the officials has happened to the provost. You had the likes of Shamani, McCartan and people like that came in when it was no longer dangerous.
We should have learned from this.
Can I put something to you, Matt? You mentioned Sean Garland. Now, Sean Garland, I associate a slightly earlier time than me, but the one who was the very much the major figure to people of my generation was Cathal Goulding. And Cathal seemed to get taken in by a guy called Dr. Roy Johnson, who I actually came across about 3 years ago.
Don't mention somebody else.
Yeah, and who by this stage seemed to have become a Green, a slightly different Green to a Republican Green. But the time you came along, it always struck me, because I wasn't living in Ireland at the time, that the Provisionals essentially had taken the clothes of the officials that Roy Johnson had sold to Cathal Goulding. How do you feel about that?
I suppose in practical terms, the provosts ended up doing the same thing as the officials did. Like I say in the book, like I have no time whatsoever for anybody who thinks they're a new IRA or whatever. I mean, I give Adams credit for having the sense to realise that it wasn't going anywhere. For my problem is the duplicity of it and the politics that followed it. It's just a complete.
Well, would you call it a sellout then? Is that, or is it just bankrupt politics?
I don't know. It's simplistic. I mean, I don't know. Malachy say the same thing about the officials. It's stupid simplistic to say that Adams or Goulding or Garland sold out. It's more complicated. You know? They're dealing with realities. They're dealing with mass movements. They had to recognise like I was in prison at the time, the ceasefire. You mentioned the book about the ban. The whole thing was just a mess.
Yeah.
Somehow it just couldn't. It was not sustainable.
Yeah.
So Adams was right in calling a halt to it, but he was also duplicitous in the way he organised it and the politics that followed, which had nothing to do with republicanism. I mean, they've recognised partition apart from the internal settlements. So.
Yeah. Coming back to the officials then, Malachy, I mean, 1968-69 was going to be the great period of revolution. You know, we had de Gaulle scarping out of France. It was going to be this wonderful mass movement of the workers and the students and the radicals and all of that, and particularly the people I knew at the time. And again, it goes. My abiding memory is attending meetings in Newman House, and on the one hand you'd have the IRA guys, and on the other hand you'd have the Socialist Workers' Party that'd been around that bloody long. And we saw ourselves as part of this great big national liberation movements that were coming out of Ghana, they were coming out of Kenya, they were coming out of South Africa and all of that. And this seemed to be coming through the official Sinn Féin, that we were part of the great national liberation struggle. And kicking the Brits out was only, in fact, if we could have united with the British left, we could have lived with the British. How much was that to the fore in the provisional or in the official movement that you joined, Malachy?
Well, I think that, there certainly was a view that there was a change in the world, but I think if we're to look at it now, I think it was a mistake to get involved in the civil rights movement. Because that, and this came from, it was inspired by people like Desmond Greaves in England and that, and the Connolly Association over there, who were supposed to be the great geniuses in all this. But that to me was always about how the Brits ran the place, not whether they should be running at all. And that's the core issue for me, that they've no right to be in Ireland. And in fact, allowing them to run it in a better way, where there's jobs and equality and all of these things, is, you're saying, as long as you run the place okay, then that's it. Then we leave you here. Whereas for us, the issue was, they've no right to be here. And I don't agree that this split was totally ideological. It was certainly opportunistic on some people's behalf. I think certainly the people who left the movement, the southern-based people who left the movement at that time, were genuine. And I mean, it's been shown right through their career where the same individuals rejected Adams in '83, in fact, and then in '86 left the Provisional movement.
Yeah. You're talking about the Rory
But
O'Donnell.
I think what we also had then was Belfast, and I think that Belfast is the problem, in that anybody, by and large, who joined the provisional movement in Belfast did so out of basically a sectarian mindset, and they were there to defend their own communities. They weren't Republicans. Whether they were nationalists or not is debatable, but they were only concerned about defending their own communities, and then they somehow got put on the clothes of Republicans. And that in part is how it has been relatively easy for Adams to sell the project and others that he has sold, where they just pile money in, give people a few jobs where they have some power and a wage coming in every week, and that kind of neutralises.
People joined the Provost or the officials in 1969. It was a legitimate response to.
Oh yeah, but it shouldn't be confused with being a Republican
on their streets.
Okay. Can I then ask you, Matt, just from your experience or just listening around, I went to Joey School in Fairview where, you know, the main one we were supposed to look up to was one Charles J. Haughey. What whispering was ever heard in, in your experience through the provisional IRA? Was there any input from Fianna Fáil? It was always this rumour that Fianna Fáil were prime movers, particularly when you look at the arms trial, that they had a vested interest in establishing the provisional movement as a bulwark against godless communists which were coming out through the official movement.
I think that's a bit simplistic. We had this argument before.
And the other
Yeah, there's no doubt that people like Haughey and Blaney were involved in supplying guns, but they also gave money to the officials.
Well, there was one amount of money which John White got in Derry, I think, but the conditions that he was given on it, the money was that he would execute a number of people, including people like Garland and McGurran, who was the Northern Commander at the time. But I think again, it's simplistic to say that Fianna Fáil done this. There's no doubt that they helped foment and create the provisional movement. They helped to fund it, they helped to arm it. But not because they were Republicans, and not because of any reason other than the selfishness and the power grab of Fianna Fáil. And Haughey himself, and I mean, I remember during the hunger strikers, people out when we were picketing Fianna Fáil headquarters, and people saying, "Oh, Haughey won't let them die." Yeah. And not alone did he let the hunger strikers die at that time, but then we have Adams who let everybody from John McDonnell on die. And you know, Adams is, and now it's accepted that Richard O'Raw's account of the deal during while John McDonnell was days from death, that's widely accepted now as being the truth. And I think, you know, Adams holds total culpability for the killing of 600 strikers.
Yeah. It would have been before your time, Matt. Now, I've always been of the view that, yes, in 1969, as Malachy says, it was there was a very much a defence posturing there that was necessary because they were coming under attack from the RUC and subsequently they were coming under attack from the army. But I've always been of the view that it probably should have ended around 74 with Sunningdale or thereabouts, that essentially it should have been pretty obvious to anybody with a clue that this was not going to be a military victory. How do you feel about that?
Yep, saying the book.
You say that very much in the book, yes.
The constitutional settlement is no different than it was in Sunningdale or Hillsborough, and that's what annoys me about the current Sinn Féin leadership, is that they pretend that it's some sort of advance on what happened 30 years ago. It's not. But the difference is, I suppose, that 1974 was a very different situation from now. We had mass loyalist killings and
but were we having mass loyalist killings in 74? I didn't really think that kicked in on yes, you did in the sense of the the RUC and the UDR were involved, but I didn't think the loyalist paramilitaries really kicked in until later.
The Murder Triangle was around that side. I know a woman from Tyrone,
Okay.
2 of her family were killed by their bread man.
Yeah.
Happened to be in the UBF. I knew them all their lives. It was a different situation. I mean, I don't know.
It's hard to look back.
It's easy to say, like,
Yeah.
Seamus Manson, like, Good Friday Green,
It's
Sunny
Sunny Day
Day for
for
slow
In fact, I
learners.
had coined that phrase before, and he coined that phrase for me, Sunny Day for slow learners. And he was right.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, the interesting thing would be, had the officials not gone on ceasefire in 72 and waited till maybe 75 or 76, then I think things would have been a lot different. And I don't think you see, the Provisionals really grew, and continued to grow from the official ceasefire. Although the officials were still operating, it would be,
Well, the officials have always been credited with Aldershot.
Yes, I mean, personally, I have no difficulty with Aldershot, and I fail to see why either that or the killing of Ranger Best were reasons to bring about a ceasefire. And ultimately that led to the Costello split down the RSP. And we see the same thing continue now. We see the split in continuity army, where, and we see the current manifestations of the IRA, and I've even lost count of the different groupings now, and I think there's probably not enough initials in the alphabet at this stage. But I mean, certainly there's no appetite or no need for an armed struggle at this. I mean, maybe not need, but there can be no return to armed struggle under the current position. Firstly, it's not justified. Secondly, it's incapable of achieving its objectives, and and we as veteran Republicans now at this stage, as the Sunday Independent described me, have a responsibility to try and ensure that the current generation is not sucked into some groupings which have no possibility of success and have no possibility of the only real option that they will end up with is spending their lives in jail.
Yes, that's a good point, because I know people who
Or in the graves.
have gone back to prison as part of dissident groups, whatever, and it's totally immoral. It's
And you see,
saying to pretend that some new IRA is going to...
Because you're very, very dismissive about what you would call the military men. That they almost seem to be people who the method is more important than the objective. Is that a reasonable summation?
Yeah, there was some clever people involved. Like, I'm talking about people who was in prison with, and when all this debate was going on about ceasefires, and there was the ban, there was Warrington, there was Shankill Road. It was just a fucking disaster, excuse me. And on the other hand, the loyalists were going out doing Loughlin Island, Greysteel, Ormo Road, and that was hugely demoralising to nationalists, because every time the IRA did something, it was usually a mess. The loyalists would come out and kill 6 or 7 people sitting in the pub watching a football match. And I was in prison with people who thought that this was some sort of success, whereas the likes of Adams and McGuinness said, look, this is going nowhere, we have to stop this. It's my differences with them would be the politics that followed that and the way they brought it about.
I think the difficulty with the what's called the dissident groups is that, with the exception of Kira, they're all post ceasefire splits, and
But isn't
many of
that
those,
very Irish thing in that sense of the word? What being said is that
But you see, I think that the difficulty is that, had these people acted as Republicans in the first place, the situation wouldn't have arisen. It was people like McKevitt who, while they were getting their way, allowed the process and allowed Adams and East Kitchen Cabinet to pursue this. And then they leave and then there's been a number of splits from them, mostly around personalities. If we look at even the early split from the Provisional Party, it was purely about not getting a particular job, nothing to do with politics, and then they will have this kind of, we're more left than you.
It's a huge level of immorality. I know people who were in their early teens when the ceasefire was called, and they're in prison now, and the people who organised them to do stuff, they didn't do anything.
Yeah. Can I put something to you, man?
And probably worse than that.
At several occasions, you seem to be fairly emphatic that Adams was in the IRA. I think there's one bit where you say, I think about page 118, that they're trying. Adams says they're trying to throw me out of the army. Is that something you stick by?
Yes.
Yeah. So why does he then consistently say I was never in the IRA? Something McGuinness might have been a bit liberal with his time scale as to when he joined or when he left, but he was clear he was in the IRA. Whereas Adams comes out with what most people then say, well, that's a fantasy jury, and therefore we suspect everything else you say after that.
Well, there's two things about that. First of all, I suppose he has practical reasons for saying he's not in the IRA, because he might, like, he was arrested over the Jean Conwell.
Yes.
So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that if he said he was in the IRA, they charge him with membership. I don't know.
Yeah.
The other thing about it though is that it's created this whole myth of what happened in the Republican movement. He was in the IRA, he was on the IRA Army Council, he was at IRA conventions when all these crucial decisions were made. So to say that he wasn't is creating a historical pretense, but it's also demeaning people who actually were in the IRA. It's not like, what's you know.
But when they come out, when he came out and he said that there's only one legitimate army in this state, meaning the Free State Army, he criminalised the movement that or the army that he says he wasn't a part of. And all I would say on that is, Billy McKee's response to that question was, let him say it to my face.
Yeah.
I don't mean me, say it to Billy McKee's face.
I'm going to throw you the curveball here tonight, and that is that I was in Australia when all the that late 80s period, early 90s, when we started hearing whispers that was going to be ceasefires and going to be peace and all of that. Now, what struck me at the time, I didn't know Adams, I knew who McGuinness was, and I'd met Bobby Story and people like that. But it always struck me, based on what I knew from crime reporting, that whenever people take positions that are diametrically opposed to what they're basically saying publicly, that somehow or other they've been doubled. What's your view on that?
Well, there's certainly speculation. I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that. But the thing that would give some weight to that is if you look around that whole kitchen cabinet, tout after tout, and agent after agent have been exposed, whether it's Scapitici, Donaldson, McShane, other people. It seems odd that all of these people will be kept in positions of power and influence. It beggars belief that there's not something else there. But, it's just touching on whether his denials about being in the army. What's even worse is you have people like MacDonald coming out and saying she believes him. Well, obviously she would have no idea one way or the other anyway. I don't think anybody has ever alleged that she was in the army, unless Fianna Fáil had a military wing at the time.
Okay, man, you talk in the book about Donaldson. Now, Donaldson, by all accounts, was turned on a very small, bit of sexual, shenanigans is the way I would put it. It strikes me is that if it was known within certain circles about Liam Adams, you can be fairly certain that the intelligence services knew about Liam Adams, and I cannot honestly believe that they would have just filed that away in a cupboard. Any thoughts?
I don't honestly know. I knew Dennis because he stayed in my house a couple of times. The fourth time I became aware of Adam's brother was when the whole thing broke. He came up for a meeting one time and somebody was saying, oh, these are all lies and stuff. And I said, like, they're obviously not. And it's the same thing with Maria Cowell. I was at a meeting when this chap who would probably consider himself a feminist called her a tramp and a whore and whatever. Listen to yourself, like, you know.
I must admit,
Women don't make up stories about rape unless there's some basis to it. You know.
Okay then, on that basis, you were arrested and as you said, they tried to do a deal with you. It seems to me now it's a great deal more subtle that we don't go in, they don't put you in a dark room and start bashing you with the rubber hoses anymore.
But you do for a while.
But it seemed to me, the more I looked into it, because in the late 80s, early 90s, I was reviewing books for the Australian radio, and a lot of the ones that seemed to be passed to me were books by Kevin Toulis, and he seemed to be very much of the view that at the end of the day, the ones who prevailed best, and I'm not going to talk about winners and losers, but the ones who prevailed best were the intelligence services. As an intelligence officer yourself, how do you feel about that? In other words, they pretty much knew enough to to turn the whole event into a stalemate.
Well, I see the story in the book when I was arrested in Market Street. I actually know for a fact that what I was doing, they caught somebody else doing a couple of days before that, and had torn them, I think, and then tried to do the same to me. And then when I was in Harker Terrace, late at night, they wanted me to meet somebody who they said was one of their own. I'm always sorry. It would have been a trick, but I'm almost sorry in retrospect that I didn't say it. They obviously had deeply infiltrated the IRA. It's not about that. Intelligence was the way to go. There's no point in just getting some leaflet from Tyrone torn because you'd only know about 3 or 4 mates. If you were in intelligence, you had the potential to destroy the whole thing. That's why Donaldson and
that's why Scappaticci was so important.
I met him once.
Any thoughts on where he is?
He's back in Italy.
Well, see, they denied
His father
that he was
died there
out.
recently.
So he's not under any threat until somebody gets some loyal felons and decides.
What do you, I mean, if you have a look, I mean, people who were touts like Martin, they were chased. They were, as I say, particularly Dennis Donaldson. He was, as we say, he was eliminated. Who knows by whom? Why do you think then Scappaticci wasn't? The story is that Scappaticci knows too much.
Because if they admit that Scappaticci was a tout, it's completely undermines their whole. I met him on training camps. Like he was there to supervise stuff. So if they admit that he was a tout, then
And you see, by them admitting it, it shows that they knew all along as well. And I have no doubt that they had to know. Because you can't operate at that level, that long, without somebody suspecting. You know, and the removal of lesser touts, you know, by the internal security. I mean, even the fact that internal security between him and Scappaticci and McGee, you know, was never, there doesn't appear to have been anybody else put into those positions. And you would have thought, and certainly in any other groupings, or even state forces, those positions are not positions that people keep forever. You know, they're the ones that are rotated on a fairly regular basis.
I mean, well, it always struck me, Matt, and you might know a bit more about this, is that the big one about Scappaticci that suggested, hold on, there's something going on here, was He was doing some interrogation or whatever, and that was the night Morrison got arrested. Now Morrison was articulate, Morrison was, you know, he was an ideas person rather than an action figure, if you know what I'm saying. Is they, shouldn't that have rung a few alarm bells?
Maybe he knew.
Okay.
But I think on that whole thing, I mean, they knew that Lynch was an agent before that, because they did, when Lynch had left, I mean, stood down from the IRA, he was, they were told that he was stood down with a question mark over him.
Okay.
And then he
See, the kind of depressing thing about it is, especially from the late 80s on, is that you had young fellas from Tyrone, Fermanagh, Belfast, Derry, who were going out and getting killed. And these people, like spiders in the middle of the web.
And I think that's the frightening thing, you know, not alone were these people being sent out to risk their own lives and liberty, they were being sent out to take other people's lives and liberty.
Well,
All being controlled by the state. And I think that, you know, and when we talk about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all of this, and you hear different demands, for instance, you know, let's have an inquiry into Nelson and Finucane and all these state guns. If we're going to have an inquiry, let's have it into everything.
Well, you'd have to, wouldn't you? Otherwise it doesn't become Truth and Reconciliation.
The young fella standing on a bus stop, waiting to go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, his life is just as valuable as Finucane or Nelson, who done well out of the system. And we see, I mean, even Finucane's son standing in Belfast South, I think, in the recent elections. The only thing that any time he was mentioned, it was prefaced by the fact that his father had been shot dead. 3,500 people died. All of their lives were as valuable to their families as Finucane, Nelson, or anybody else.
Mentioned the book about Taban, that myself and a few other people were playing Scrabble, and this fella from Yori came running down and said, "Oh, we got 8 of them, we got 8 of them." That's, so we said, "British soldiers?" No, like Henry Brothers. There was a fella from Kerry who'd actually been involved in the border campaign. He was in his early 60s at this stage, and he said, "Well, you know, if we were blowing up barracks and they were rebuilding them, then there might be some excuse." You know? And I remember thinking, for fuck's sake, what was the point?
Okay.
And but in fairness, Adams and McGuinness, they also were thinking that as well.
Yeah, but then at the same time, just before that, McGuinness had authorised the one in Derry where they strapped Gillespie, was it, into the truck and drove it into the barracks, you know.
The Irish version of the suicide bomber.
Yeah, well, in Derry, they had done, I remember being in Derry, and I had an aunt living in Derry, she's actually dead 18 years yesterday, and I remember going up to visit her when she moved up there first and saying, "The war's over here." You know, and there was no war in Derry for a long time, you know, from the mid-80s. And McGuinness had effectively wound it down, but they had never really held, the Provisionals never really held Derry. I mean, the officials had held it, and then the IRA were very strong in it. And it was only in latter years with the political movements that they really took control of Derry. But when you have, you know, politicians who think it's okay to tweet and complain about the size of their hotel room when they're going to London, you know, it shows it's a long way from, you know, sleeping on somebody's floor or, you know, somebody's spare room or something when people will be on the run or you know, even staying. And I mean, remember, you see, looking at the changes in small things like, for you say the Irish was coming up in the big ads in the paper, in the, either the United Irishman or on Footblock, you know, looking for billets, and they then changed to the price of hotel room.